Hi there. Thanks for tuning in again. I did a video recently on my meeting with and a connection with and conversations with a guy named Frank Stranges. Frank wrote A Stranger at the Pentagon. It was a book that tells a story that he claims was a real story, true story, about him meeting a person, a being, claiming to be from Venus that had come to bring a message of love and hope to humanity. And he asked to meet with political officials, which he supposedly did. And Frank Stranges tells that story. And so I did a video previously about that, about my meeting with Frank and getting to know Frank a little bit. And then a strange experience that I had because he and I were speakers at a conference. So I'm only going to repeat this a little bit and then go into something new about that experience. Because the video was fairly well accepted from people, so I thought, well, I'll share a little bit more about what happened, and maybe at the most one more after this, depending on the interest and so on. But, I met Frank at a conference, and we were both keynote speakers, and, I didn't know at first really about what his work was about. It happens a lot of times you meet different speakers, and but a lot of kind of supernatural things did kind of happen before I knew what he was about. And so, it really led me to believe that his experiences were true. So I'll just tell you a little bit more about it. I'll just elaborate a bit anyway. That's just a recap anyway. If you want to know more, go and check out the first video, and it kind of covers that. That was a conference in BC, Canada in the early 90s. And it's quite a beautiful place, but I did a couple talks at this conference, and Frank did a couple of talks. So Frank was known for his book, again, Stranger at the Pentagon, and it really is quite an extraordinary story. And this man, he says, was Valiant Thor, was the guy's name, or Val. He said that, that was his name, but that's not his real name. That's just what people called him. That's what he asked us to call him, or people to call him. And so that's where we begin now, really take off from that point. And so Thor is kind of a dramatic name. And Frank told me a little bit about this, but I also spoke to the person who claimed to be Valiant Thor. And I'll just tell you what he told me, and take it or leave it. But he said the name was kind of a dramatic name, but it was kind of what people expected at that time. This was in the 50s that he met Frank Stranges. And so, Valiant Thor, it's like, something you would have read in a sci-fi book or in a movie, a sci-fi movie at the time. And he said, so that's why the name was chosen. It's not like that was actually his name, per se. This is what I got out of the conversation anyway. And that the name actually had some layers of meaning, like valiant, the very idea, integrity and strength and courage and so on. And yet, I remember him saying something about valiant having a play on words also with validate, valiant and validate, meaning this is true or something to that effect. And he explained that there are beings on Venus to this day, that they're not technically three-dimensional, but they can densify. And he says that these people from Venus have been here before, that people have talked about them before with mixed levels of success. But they've tried to, announce their presence and that they represent messages of peace, which makes sense because astrologically Venus is considered to be a planet of love and peace. But he says they're not three-dimensional. He did say, this is Valiant saying to me, because we had a kind of a conversation at one point and a couple points, but he explained that there were once three-dimensional beings in other planets, like he said, not on Venus, but on Mars. I know this may sound a bit out there. But he said there once were beings in the three-dimension, but their atmosphere got messed up through warring and catastrophes, so they're not there now. He said the atmosphere got destroyed, and so that affected the place for people to live. I'm a spiritual teacher, and I've always believed in all topics lead home, all topics come together. Whether it's healing, you would say, well, what does healing have to do with aliens? And what does aliens have to do with Bible? And what does Bible have to do with such and such, and on and on? All topics come together as far as I'm concerned. Always taught that way, always will. And that's kind of what I'm most known for, is that I don't teach like a linear, just one topic. I teach that really all things come together when you keep an open enough mind. So Val told me that peace was not something that they were really here to create, but it was in fact inevitable. It's not something he was here to force, but that it was inevitable. He talked about it would be up to us to decide when to accept such a concept of world peace and so on. Let's see, we also talked about, we talked about some bizarre things like he said in the past, various ET groups, extraterrestrial groups, have had various times interacting with the human race. The Venusians, he says, played a behind-the-scenes role. They were not one of the most extreme influencers of the Earth as much as they were kind of behind the scenes. And, he said that there were beings, different races that warred quite a bit for the Earth and on the Earth and so on. He talked about it and said even in the galaxy or the solar system, there were beings of different dimensionalities that would war, or for millions of years, he said, these things went on. But he said it wasn't until the time of Christ, that's what he said, the time of Christ, and somehow Christ, he didn't elaborate much on it, but somehow Christ brought peace to even some of the warring species or races, if you want to call it that. Let's see, and then we talked about, I asked him if some of the groups were influencing different races, and he said, if you really want to know which groups or civilizations on Earth the Venusians really most influenced, you would just have to look at some of the obvious signs. For example, like the races that worshipped the Venus as a goddess or as a planet. He said that's how you would kind of know, is if they're honoring that was actually them. They were not worshiping the planet or the goddess as much as people think. He said it was more of a homage to Venusians and the work they had done with planet Earth. And he said that's Native American tribes and some of the mystical groups and so forth. He said the ones that relate, like some of the Templars and so forth, some of the groups related to Venus. That's how to know when they had that's their thumbprint. That's how you know that they had been there. If you want to know them, distinguishing them from other groups and other influences. He spoke of some of the cases being very like groups that created peaceful introductions, like the Western man, the European man, to the Native Americas. He said they were definitely influencing that. But that's all what I already said. But he did mention that because he said that's when the natives, in some cases, had already been influenced by Venus or love, and they brought that. Some of them brought that vibe to some of the new settlers. Even though we were taught, in school that this was only the Pilgrims had a nice moment here and there, that tribes were always warring and dangerous to the settlers. He talked about really key times when it was just the opposite. Really, really cool when love met love, peace met peace, good people met good people. And he said that they were sort of behind some of the influence of that. In fact, he referred to his mission, or the mission of the Venusians, as the message of, or the message or the mission of love. So that was another thing. And then he said, he told me a bizarre account of, just lots of things. In the bit of time we talked, we kind of went so many different places. But one thing that was interesting is that when we were talking, every so often I would look over at Frank, and Frank was an interesting character because when he's talking, he was quite animated, but in the time I hung out with him, he was often kind of silent. But he would kind of sit there with his grin, not laughing, but just kind of an "I told you so" kind of a grin. But what's funny is he hadn't told me per se because I didn't talk to him yet. We got there, things were coming together, we both did our talk, and my contact with Valiant wasn't really until after my first talk. Then the light bulbs all went off, but I was just kind of focused on my talk. But this guy appears out of nowhere, and I talk with him, and I'm just going, wow, this is just a trip, But skeptics could say, no, no way. But let me just share to give both sides of this. One thing I can say for the skeptics, maybe, this could easily have been a trained actor, somehow plotted special effects for him to just show up and then be gone instantaneously. I'll give you that. Anything's possible. He could have been a trained actor, except he wouldn't have known the questions I was going to ask and to really know about that, especially since at this time, very little, the early 90s, some things were known, but very little was known in comparison to these other species and races. I knew these things, but there was no really big network for somebody, just a random actor, to have been trained in these topics. So it doesn't seem as likely. But besides that, just for the skeptic's sake, that is a possibility, an actor of some kind. He did have a countenance about him, an energy, a really loving, peaceful energy about him. You have to consider that, besides him knowing things that I was going to ask. And then you have to consider that he did seem to appear and disappear. I said in the first video stories about that, but my first encounter was like that. It was kind of funny because I felt a little like silly, like naive, Here I was just hanging out with Frank and these other speakers, mostly Frank and I, but we and the other speakers, we went for a drive. We were taken on a ride across a beautiful lake, and the captain of the ship allowed, I think it might have been 2 or 3 of us to steer the ship, which is a pretty good sized ship, and a big lake, beautiful lake. But Frank took a little time on it, and I took a little time, and he taught us, told us how to navigate the ship. But it was just beautiful. It was cool. But we went to explore some caves and all that. But we weren't. He and I were not jibber jabbering all this time about that, because again, he was a little lower key than you might think. But it was really cool. But once the door was open, it was open. Once I was like, talking to Val, and then people later, other speakers and some of the attendees, they were like, well? I'm like, well, what? And they're going, what did he say? Who? You mean Frank? Or, no, Val. I'm like, what are you talking about? They're going, the guy that was there and not there. I didn't know yet the story about Val, so I didn't know when they're saying Val or the guy, the alien, the being. I'm like, what do you people, like, you guys are frying on something, or, what do you smoke out here, in BC? I thought this is like, you just kind of assume they're just kind of out, sometimes you meet some out there people. Then when I was told the story, I'm like, wait, it all starts kind of coming together and so forth. But, take this for what you may. I've taught the topic of ancient alien since 1980, maybe. I still use good discernment, though. I start making sure, okay, well, this guy was there and then he wasn't there. Where could he have gone? Is this for real? Is this a friend of his? Did I hear this right? Did they say, Frank's friend? Oh, well, he's a friend. Or he's a relative. I don't know what he is, But it all starts coming together once I knew there's this guy, supposedly, that Frank met. This guy, then I find Frank's book. He gives me a copy. I look, and he looks just like the guy, not even really older than the guy in the book, and the photos were from the 50s of him with Valiant Thor. So it's kind of trippy, in a good way. Then I start going, well, wait a minute. So I met this guy, but this guy looks the same as he did in the 50s. Then he's supposed to be named Valiant Thor, and then he's related to Venus, and I totally believe in beings from other planets, other star systems for that matter. Then the deeper implications, which is, and he's a messenger. He has a mission called the mission or the message of love, and the mission of love. That's kind of cool. Then I'm looking for my connection. Then I'm asking him in a subsequent conversation too, but I'm asking him, deeper questions, like about spiritual things and about their history and so on. So that was important to kind of connect those pieces. For me, that was important, instead of just the, ooh, are you really? And, so on. And that stuff I think is in the book anyway, about him talking to political officials and that sort of thing. But my take was to say, the deeper, the spiritual, and I enjoyed the time we talked about that. But this guy was, tuned in, and he was like, we know about your work, and it's connected to our work. And he was talking about the greater mission that we're all part of, which I call God's plan for salvation. But, he was aware of things like that. And He could connect pieces that I didn't usually run into people that would connect, like ancient civilizations and, Native American wisdom, not just the tribal wisdom, but there's a wisdom that they were tapped into from the star elders, as they call them. So that was kind of cool. But then tying that into my work and my work about the history, how the connection of spirit has been there all along. It's not just like some genetic ET story like you hear on History Channel today. There's a multi-leveled experience going on amongst these species and groups and civilizations. But it really isn't about genetics and just ETs and science and technologies. That's just for linear-headed people. That's as far as they can go with it. But it's much deeper. This is really about not just the evolution of a body or cells or genetics. This is about spiritual evolution. And Val definitely got that. And you could feel that from him, but he got that. There's just this, just like an elder, a native elder or whatever, just a state of wisdom, a master Buddhist. There's just this state of wisdom that there's an understanding, And so as I'm talking about things and asking questions, kind of intrigued, there was just this beauty. I would say that it was a look of acceptance, a look of, yeah, you're onto it. Yeah, that's right. It was just really cool. And, but also a look of encouragement, like keep going, and you're going to, you and I, meaning him, you, Michael, and I, and others, we're all in this thing together, and we're going to keep influencing humanity towards a life of connection, a life of peace, and back to awareness of God, because it is all about God. And, but again, that there is life on other planets. We talked about that, and other masters have spoken of that. Casey, Blavatsky, and then various forms of sciences and mysticism throughout, mystics throughout history and masters from the Far East. So these things are kind of known, but to sit with somebody that says, yeah, and I'm one of them, it's like, wow. But there were other things. There were other conversations about the mystical, about the deeper connection, about the validity of God and God's role with us in all this. That things are beyond science. In fact, he was saying, Venusians keep almost like a blessing to Earth of keep the heart open. It's almost like he's saying the other guys, the other groups sometimes are about getting your head going into technologies and science and crafts and dimensional movements and, the linear stuff. And in a sense, he was saying, that exists as per the sayings of some of these people and some of the experts on ancient aliens today. But he was also saying that exists, but that's not actually what's important. The heart is higher than the mind in terms of its importance and what it can give us. So that was a really, really, probably, I don't know, maybe that's the most important thing he was getting across, which is a shame because in Frank's book, he was talking more about the experience. If it's a valid experience, what he said, valid and valiant. If it's a valid experience, he was saying, he met these officials from Kennedy's to, Eisenhower to Nixon or whatever. And some were very intrigued, but said, I believe in this. And you're right, Valiant, or Val, as we sometimes call him, but it's not going to happen. This government isn't going to acquiesce. There's systems and money in place and paranoias and beliefs and control. This isn't going to happen. So he would just present it, and then step aside if it wasn't accepted and just wait for the next person to interview him or talk to him or whatever. But he did talk to a few different people. But that stuff Frank, I think, mentions in his book. I don't know. I don't remember if I read the book. I honestly don't because it's been 20 years since I met him. But anyway, something to consider. These things do exist. There are more things in heaven and earth than all of your philosophies, and they do. And it was kind of a cool thing. If the guy was an actor, it was an interesting experience, and how he popped in and out and created a countenance about him, don't know. This just beautiful energy, this aura of light about him. But if it's real and valid, then somebody's got to consider that and say, wait, you're saying that there possibly are beings that have been in touch with government that said, we're here to help, and they said, no thanks. But they didn't retaliate. They don't do anything. They're just going, okay, we're just here to let you know we're here if you're open to us helping. The funny thing is, it's not because the government is saying no. They're saying no to peace. That's what they were doing, honestly. They were saying no to peace. There are other civilizations or species out there that have interacted with our government that were not turned away. And that can be kind of scary if you know which kinds, have influenced the world. And Valiant, was talking about some of those. I'm not going to name names, but he just said it's all leaked in there. It's all weird. He said, like, you guys come up with electronic transistors out of the blue, but did you ever think that the acronym is ET? He said these are technologies that are given by what I'm calling freaky, not so benevolent species. So these are things, that he sort of validated and so forth. But validating some of the other stuff is very cool, very interesting. But I also felt better hearing about the validation of love and the validation of God's role, and that other beings do respect that role and recognize there's nothing higher than God itself, and that even these beings recognize that they're part of the creation of that spirit. So I really appreciate all that, and just love being around that space of loving people. And he had that energy. Boy, it's one of those where you think, God, if you could bottle that, it'd be just great. But I appreciate good people, and I appreciate people like Frank who were willing to tell his story. As far as I could tell, everything was authentic about it. And I really appreciate that he had the courage to share it, and that you might have the courage to watch something like this. Because like I said, I've had students of my own who just turned their backs and walked out of lectures I was doing because they were thinking they were going to hear Michael talk about just oneness or peace, happiness, how to become joyous, or something more spiritual or self-help. And once in a while, I kind of moved into light beings, multidimensionality, Venusians or whatever, and they're like, cuckoo, they think he's lost it. And it's kind of weird to lose students and friends because of just telling what you know to be true. But it's a kind of a rude awakening sometimes to go, oh, I forgot. Then I have a decision to make. Shut the door on that and never talk about it so I don't lose those couple of people, or just soldier on through, forward and allow it to be taught because it's true. And that's pretty much what I tend to do. All right, so thanks very much for your time. And again, if you're interested, I could share some more of what Valiant taught me, it's shared with me, but also about the experience of meeting him and so on, any nuances and so on. All right, so you can post some questions if you have them, and that might give me an idea what direction to take it, so I know, just to keep it concise, okay? So thanks very much for your interest, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.